خدا حفظتون کنه. بسم الله الرحمن الرحیم. لا حول ولا قوة الا بالله العلی العظیم. الحمد لله رب العالمین و صلی الله علی سیدنا و نبینا ابی القاسم المصطفى محمد و آله الطیبین الطاهرین لا سیما بقیة الله فی الارضین عجل الله تعالی فرجه الشریف. اللهم اخرجني من ظلمات الوهم واكرمني بنور الفهم. اللهم افتح علينا ابواب رحمتك وانشر علينا خزائن علومك برحمتك يا ارحم الراحمين. Alhamdulillah, we have tawfiq to study in this semester Illuminationist School of Islamic Philosophy. As you know, there are three major schools in Islamic philosophy. One is the Peripatetic philosophy, Hikmatul Mashya, and one is Hikmatul Ishraq, which is the Illuminationist school, and one is Al-Hikmatul Muta'aliyah, the transcendent philosophy of Mullah Sadra. Inshallah, first we will have some introductory discussions, and then we will inshallah enter into the core of this kind of philosophy and discuss the major inshallah issues there. What inshallah I'm going to share with you today is a kind of general outlook of Islamic philosophy before Sheikh Ishraq, to see major developments and some issues which led to the formation of this school. And for this session, and maybe next session, for the introductory discussions, we will use the book آموزش حکمت اشراق by Sayyid Yadullah Yazdan Pana, which is compiled and organized by Mr. Amini Nejat. May Allah inshallah bless them and bless all who have contributed to this field. In the first part of this book, there is a good introduction, and I thought that is good for us to begin with. This is in the first chapter, and it is entitled Kulliyati dar bab hikmat ishraq. This part of the book is available online. I found the PDF, maybe you have it. If you don't have it, I can share with you. But unfortunately, I didn't find the PDF for the whole book. I found it up to page 30. If you have access to the PDF for the whole book, please let me know. So, the first thing is a general scheme of Islamic philosophy before Sheikh Ishraq. So, as you know, Muslim philosophers were introduced to logic and philosophy of Aristotle and some other Greek philosophers very soon. From the first, maybe from the second, but maybe even some traces from the first century, but at least from the second century, serious encounter started. Translation, commenting were there. So when we have people like Ya'qub ibn Ishaq Kandi, who died in 260, already we have someone that we can call a philosopher. It takes time to have someone that can master the text and subjects and understand and take position. But we have someone like Kendi in the 3rd century. Then we have Abu Nasr Farabi, who died in 339. Then we have Ibn Sina, who died in 428, who is in a sense, the peak of Islamic philosophy, at least up to the time of Mullah Sadra. So from the 3rd century up to the middle of the 5th century, we have philosophers who understood Greek philosophy, but they were not satisfied just with understanding. They expanded. They sometimes added subjects, added arguments. Sometimes they try to apply them to some Islamic doctrines and bring philosophical discussion into the religious doctrines and positions. So we have now a new form of philosophy. Yes, it is loyal to some of the major principles of Aristotelian approach, but they have benefited from different Greek philosophers. They have added their own contributions. So according to this book, it says that we can even talk here about Islamic reading or Islamic version of Greek philosophy. And therefore, when these were translated from Arabic to Latin and to European languages, they found them very useful. Even when they were able to read later Greek texts by themselves, because initially they didn't have access to the Greek text and they were using Arabic translations. So this is a new development. They had numerous works, especially Ibn Sina, in different fields. In Hikmah, both theoretical branch and practical branch. Theoretical means mathematics, physics, and ilahiyat, theology. Practical, like akhlaq, for house management, tadbir manzil, for siyasat mudun, how to run the, like politics, and also akhlaq as a personal and interpersonal relations, science that deals with akhlaq. So akhlaq, tadbir manzil, siyasat mudun for the practical side. But he had also a book on logic, on astronomy. So they developed very much this. But they had opponents. There were people who were against using aql and intellectual discourse in religious matters. And there are people who also maybe they had interest in intellectual discourse, but still they were not satisfied with some of the positions that peripatetic philosophers had taken. So there was a challenge here. The author says one challenge was that they were using exclusively rational or intellectual reasoning. And that was also only through Aristotelian logic and formal logic when it comes to methodology. Just reasoning based on the universal concepts and on the premises and deduction. And then when it comes to some religious issues like resurrection like the knowledge of Allah about particular things, about how Allah is the doer and the agent despite having a system and hierarchy, about whether the world is created or eternal, about resurrection, is it corporeal or not. Things like this. The author gives us a list of some of the topics that you are familiar with, which were very controversial among Muslim thinkers, philosophers on the one hand, mutakallimin on the other hand, and Ahl Hadith who were even against Kalam as a third group, third approach. So there were lots of questions and debates. Then we have also people who had more Sufi kind of and mystical and spiritual kind of approach. They were not like mutakallimin or Ahl Hadith, but not like also philosophers. They were thinking that we need to work on our spirituality and find realities instead of just argue for them, and taste and witness the realities. So all different groups had issues with peripatetic philosophy. The author refers to Fakhruddin al-Razi, who died in 604, Imam al-Mushakkikin, as a representative of theological or Kalami approach, who was critical of philosophers. But of course, he was studying philosophy. He has himself, commentary on al-Isharat wa tanbihat. Many times he himself is, discussing in a philosophical way. But anyway, he was more mutakallim than philosopher. And philosophers, as Ayatollah Mutahari says, benefited from questions and objections made by him, even if some of them were not very, strong. But as a whole, it helped philosophers to make their positions, more organized and, fortified. We will talk about it a little bit. Or Ghazali, Abu Hamid Ghazali, who died in 505, from a Sufi and mystical approach. Fakhruddin Razi was more Kalami and Ghazali was more Sufi. So in his book Maqasidul Falasifa, which is a very good book actually for Hikmat Masha, and when we were in Tehran University, we were doing Western philosophy, but we had some courses on Islamic philosophy, on Hikmat Masha, Hikmat Ishraq, and Hikmat Mutaliyah. One of our professors used Maqasidul Falasifa for teaching Hikmat Masha, because a good explanation of Hikmat Masha. Then he compiles Tahafutul Falasifa. First, Maqasidul Falasifa is like Hikmat Masha. Then Tahafutul Falasifa is about contradictions that he believed exist among philosophers. So these debates and encounters were very hot, and this led to decline somehow in philosophy, to the extent that when Ibn Rushd, Averroes, from Spain, from Andalus, who died in 595, tried to defend philosophy, it was very difficult. He compiled Tahafut al-Tahafut to reply to Ghazali. He did great work. He has good commentaries on Aristotle's works. But it was very difficult, to the extent that some Orientalists, they think that maybe Ibn Rushd or Averroes was the last great Muslim philosopher, which is not the case. We have always had in the Shia seminaries great philosophers. Mullah Sadra is an example, but it's not the only one. But for large part of Muslim world, after Ibn Rushd, there is no great philosopher. Why? Because so much attack was there. I'm sorry, I have to go to the door just to check and see. So we continue. So, in large, as I said, the common way of doing philosophy, which was the peripatetic philosophy, faced lots of challenges, and even someone like Averroes or Ibn Rushd was not able to solve all the problems. So therefore, in a great part of Muslim world, philosophy somehow went into decline. Although there always been in some people who studied philosophy, but we don't have great philosophers in some parts of the Muslim world. But this is not the whole story. Certain things happened that led to revival and even development of philosophy in the Muslim world, or Islamic philosophy. So the author refers to two main factors. One is that philosophy was strong in itself. It had issues. It was not yet, well developed, advanced. But intellectual discourse and following rules of logic in reasoning is strong. So someone like Khaja Nasiruddin Tusi, Rizwanullah Ta'ala alayh, who died in 672 after Hijrah, managed to develop philosophical positions in the way that could answer some of the objections, some of the challenges, and develop them in a very scholarly way, with a proper articulation of the positions. And as you know, after Khaja Nasiruddin Tusi, Kalam and philosophy somehow met each other, somehow merged. I don't want to say 100%, but you find him as a great theologian, but also a great philosopher. So at least that kind of challenge and fighting or encounter, encounter that existed in some parts after Khaja is not like that. So philosophy went to a higher level, succeeded to overcome some of the challenges, and show that some of the attacks were not good attacks, were not strong, were based on misunderstanding. Some of them. For some of them, he managed to improve the philosophical position because there were some issues that needed improvement. Also, the author says that people also noticed that some of the people who were against philosophy and against reasoning and against aql in the name of Sufism, etc., some of them were not very deep. And people realized that they were somehow superficial. And then because of that and because of lacking intellectual assessment for their positions, sometimes they reached wrong positions, wrong ideas. And therefore there was a need for aql to get involved and assess even claims and findings of Sufis. So this is one aspect. Another aspect is that Muslim philosophers themselves realize that they need to revise. They realize that there are limitations. Even someone like Ibn Sina, that for sure he's maybe the master of peripatetic philosophers in the Muslim world, even Ibn Sina himself was aware of the limitations and restrictions in peripatetic philosophy. Whether it comes to methodology and just relying on intellectual discourse, or on some of the positions which are achieved or reached based on the methodology. So the author refers in particular to Ibn Sina's attempt in introducing a new way of philosophy that can be more also compatible and friendly with some of the revealed ideas. In his introduction to Mantiq al-Mashriqiyin, and this Mashriqiyin has a relation with Ishraq, because Mashriq is where Shuruq and Ishraq take place. So already refers to the spiritual side and mystical findings. So he says in the introduction to Mantiq al-Mashriqiyin that Aristotle was a great thinker. He emphasizes on some of the strengths of Hikmat al-Mashai, but at the same time he criticizes some of the late Masha'un, that they were taking Aristotle's positions, so dearly, that they were not happy to criticize or to work for improvement of that. It was somehow sacred for them. They were not able to see that there are some also issues that need to be modified or improved. Ibn Sina himself, when he was a teenager, or later when he became young, so he mastered Falsafa Mashai, Hikmat Mashai, peripatetic philosophy, but was not satisfied with that, and therefore he found things other than Greek legacy or heritage, and he calls it Ma'arif Mashriqiyan, some of the teachings that the people of Mashriq here is not just East, although it refers mainly to the people who were from East, because we have, for example, Iranian philosophers who had some kind of Platonic approach or Ishraqi approach, but it can also be not geographical in a geographical sense. In any way, he talks about his project of working on this kind of new approach. Of course, he was not able to finish and complete the project, but we find that he has done something on that. He says Shifa, the book Ash-Shifa, was for the general readers of philosophy of the past. Those who are interested in peripatetic philosophy, he wrote Shifa for them, and he says it's for them, and it's more than enough for them. But Mantiq al-Mashriqiyin is for the people that they want to go further, is for the elite. That is for the like general public or the lay people among philosophers, but this is for the elite. But he says, in presenting my ideas, I exercised precaution. Why? Because he says those who are busy and engaged and involved in studying philosophy, they were very interested and impressed by Greek philosophy. And I didn't want to make them upset, because these are the seekers of knowledge and learning, and these were nice people. He didn't, in my words, maybe he didn't want to attack them or criticize what is dear to them, and give opportunity to people who were against philosophy as a whole and reasoning as a whole. So he says he didn't want to confront them, and on the other hand, he says these are the people who were the best people to help and to get engaged with them. So although I was aware of some of the difficulties and problems in Hikmat al-Masha, he says, I tried, instead of saying this is the problem, I tried to explain and to improve their arguments so that as much as possible it would be able to stand on its own. I tried to overlook also some of the problems, but sometimes there was no choice. I had to explain that there are issues. And then he says that unfortunately some people are so much attached to what they have received that he says, although they may call themselves philosophers or students of philosophy, but they are more like some Ahl Hadith who followed Hanbali approach to Hadith, because these people were against using aql in religion. The author says that if you study al-isharat wa tanbihat, you find that sometimes he refers that he has something more to offer, but he's hesitant. For example, in chapter 28 of the third Namat, if you want, this is on page 9 of the book by Sayyidi Azam Pana. So he says on the issue which is about aflaq, the skies, he says وَتَحْتَ هَذَا سِرٌ, there is a secret about this issue. This is in the third Namat. In altogether is 10 Namats in Isharat and Tanbiyat. Then in the sixth Namat, end of 10th chapter, again he says وَفِيهِ سِرٌ. Then in the 14th chapter of the same Namat, he says وَأَنْتَ إِذَا طَلَبْتَ الْحَقَّ بِالْمُجَاهَدَةِ فِيهِ. If you seek the truth with making a spiritual efforts and struggling, not just reading and studying. فَرُبَمَا لَوْ حَلَكَ سِرٌ. Maybe the secret becomes clear for you. And this secret is واضح خفي. On the one hand, it's clear. On the other hand, it's concealed. Because if you have the right approach, you will find it easy. If you have not right approach, you would not understand it. And then in the 9th chapter of 10th, the last Namat, he shows that he is not happy with the majority of peripatetic philosophers and starts arguing for nafs kulliyeh, that aflaq, they have nafs, they have soul. So, in general, he took peripatetic approach, but he is aware, and he started this second approach in some of the works. For example, Risalatul Ishq, and also in Salaman wa Absal, in Hayy ibn Yaqzan. Alhamdulillah, we had tawfiq to study the nice section of Al-Isharat wa Tanbihat in English, and we have mentioned the story of Salaman Absal at the beginning. Wa Risalatul Tayr, and the 8th, 9th, 10th Namat of Isharat. So he gives a glimpse of this approach, the second approach. This is very important because you shouldn't think Sheikh Ishraq started without any background. Even this title of Mashriqiyin is very important. Even Hikmat Muta'aliyah, which is the title of transcendent philosophy of Mullah Sadra, this was used first by Ibn Sina, and says this is a higher, a more advanced philosophy. Like, Burhan al-Siddiqin, although Mullah Sadra developed it, but the expression was used first by Ibn Sina, but he used it for Burhan al-Wujub wa Imkan. He thought that is Siddiqin, the direct way of arguing for God, from God. Khaja Nasir al-Din Tusi, Rizwanullah ta'ala alayh, in Al-Isharat wa Tanbihat, he says, إنما جعل هذه المسألة من الحكمة المتعالية. He says the reason Ibn Sina made this problem part of حكمة متعالية is because لأن حكمة المشائين بحثية صرفة. This issue of afla cannot be solved just by bahsiyatun sarfa, something which is just based on reasoning and discussion. أمثالها إنما تتم مع البحث والنظر بالكشف والذوق. It's very important to find the traces of Hikmat Ishraq, even in work of Ibn Sina. He says this kind of issues only can be adequately discussed if you have both bahth wa nadar but also kashf wa dhawq. He says مع البحث إنما تتم مع البحث والنظر, in addition to discussion and intellectual approach, بالكشف والذوق. فالحكمة المشتملة عليها متعالية بالقياس إلى بالقياس إلى الأولى. With respect to the first type, which is just bahthi, this is higher. It's called حكمة متعالية. But then we have Shaykh Ishraq. Inshallah, we will talk about his life and his background, inshallah, in the next session. What made the project of Shaykh Ishraq different is that, first of all, maybe because he lived in a different time, he was not that hesitant and that much, precocious like Ibn Sina in expressing his criticism of peripatetic philosophers and philosophy. Maybe because the situation was more calm, maybe so many attacks which were taking place by mutakallimin and Sufis and mystics against philosophy were settled somehow. There were not those many attacks, etc. So he found it's the time that you can freely discuss these problems and criticize the ideas of Aristotle and peripatetic philosophers. Of course, Sayyid Yazdan Pana says that he did too much. He overdid. So Ibn Sina was hesitant, but he went too much to criticize, and gradually some of the mistakes that he had appeared. It's not that all his criticism was in its place, and if you really understood peripatetic philosophy, you could defend its positions against some of this criticism. But anyway, he had some more free critical approach. Number two is that unlike Ibn Sina, who gave glimpses of his project in different books, different places, different topics, but he couldn't complete the project of Mantiq al-Mashriqiyin. Maybe he didn't want, maybe even he wrote, but it didn't remain. The book says that maybe also it didn't remain. Anyway, we don't have now the complete project of Ibn Sina for the second level of philosophy. But Sheikh Ishraq managed to organize a full, structure. The third thing is that he also changed the methodology, because a very important foundation for philosophy and any science is first to know what kind of methodology you want to apply. And he said that we have to change a methodology. We should still use bahs and istidlal, intellectual discourse, but it's not enough. We cannot limit ourselves to that. Another thing which is very important is that he himself had a very spiritual life, very mystical life. And it was not just he was strong in reasoning and philosophizing. He was also himself very spiritual, and he had some mystical experiences. In particular, we may refer to the experience that he had when he had, in a position like between sleeping and being awake, had an encounter with Aristotle. Inshallah, we will talk about it. So he had understood through his mystical findings many things that later he tried to argue for them as well. But he says, even if my arguments are questioned, I'm not going to doubt. I am certain. Because these are parallel. It's not that if you question my reasoning, I lost. No. I have also understood it from another way. So, this is a general introduction to the philosophy of Sheikh Ishraq and the project of Sheikh Ishraq. Inshallah, in the next session we can talk about his history, some of his works, and then enter into, inshallah, some of the topics that he discussed. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin.